I'm Sabrina Hornung. I'm a regional artist, I guess. I work in a variety of mediums. I work in mixed media, cyanotype, and Scherenschnitte, which is a traditional German folk art involving cut paper. So the first, I guess I could tell you a little bit more about myself. I'm originally from Jamestown. I happen to drift back and forth. I like the term drifter. But I went to MSUM in pursuit of photography, but then I wound up dropping out with every good intention of going back, but it just didn't happen. And initially when I studied photography, I wanted to study, or I did darkroom photography, and I kind of fell in love with the process, with the not with the chemicals, but with the reaction the chemicals would have, during the whole process. And it would be kind of like one of those, well, I wonder what would happen if I would do this. And that was what I felt was the best part of the darkroom process. So after exploring a few alternative processes, I came up with my mixed media work, which involves taking a photo digitally and then building a collage on top of it, and then making a photo transparency and painting on it with acrylic and spray paint. So it gets, and usually when I make them, it's kind of one of those where it's like, I'll kind of laugh to myself, because I don't know, it's just kind of ridiculous and fun. So the first piece that kind of started it all is called "The Land and the People Hold Memories," and it was inspired. The whole reason that I made it, I was invited to participate in the Great Midwestern 2009, I believe. And the theme was birthright and legacy. And the best thing about Mr. O'Rourke, he had the most complex themes, and it would just be one of those where you try to kind of wrap your head around it and think, oh man, how can I translate that? But I read this poem from Carl Sandburg that was published in 1926 called "The Prairie," and it was just one of those things that was it was so romantic, but it was romantic in the sense where if you grew up around here, you can instantly relate to it. And one of the lines that really got me was, "The land and the people hold memories, even among the anthills and the angleworms, among the toads and wood roaches, among gravestone writings rubbed out by the rain. They keep old things that never grow old." And it was the perfect way to kind of mix together my strong German background. I was raised by my grandma and grandpa, and she came over in 1955, so our home was kind of like a little Germany. And then my grandpa was kind of is this kind of staunch John Wayne character, so it was just kind of like growing up with those two strong personalities, something interesting is gonna happen. So, but yeah, I also included a couple kids in dirndls and lederhosen. I grew up in dirndls, like literally we have dirndls that fit like a toddler up until, a 6-foot frame. And I'm mildly obsessed with Western kitsch, so I mean, girl on a jackalope just really made sense. So here are a few of my pieces. This one's called "Tumbleweed Sweetheart," and that's actually inspired by kind of a regional folk tale. There's a book by, what was it? Dorothy de Saint Clement, I believe. It was called, I can't even think of what it was called off the top of my head. But she had all these anecdotes she grew up in Western North Dakota during the dawn of statehood, and she would kind of write anecdotes about colorful characters and just kind of stories that she would hear throughout her childhood. And one of them involved kind of like a message in a bottle scenario. And it was, there's quite a bunch of tumbleweeds out there. I kind of identify with tumbleweeds, I just kind of drift from, around trying to, you get caught up somewhere and then you go off on your way again, I guess. But the thing with the tumbleweed sweetheart was bachelors or bachelorettes would have a ribbon and they would put their name and address on it in hopes of finding their sweetheart. And if you found a tumbleweed with the address, you had to go and find, wherever it came from. And there was a story of a a successful tumbleweed finding, I guess, and somebody found their cowboy sweetheart. But and with these, I like to use a lot of vintage imagery. I find I'm a thrift store and antique junkie, so I go to these shops and I find interesting ephemera and think of ways that I can incorporate them into my work, whether it's personifying the flora and fauna or just being kind of ridiculous. This one's called Pod People. It's a milkweed plant, and there's these little cowboys coming out of it because, I also enjoy old horror movies, and there's this one that's called, or it has to do with the Pod People and Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Thank you. But I was kind of thinking of that, and I was, milkweed pods, they're kind of weird looking, but they're pretty cool. And if anything would come out of them, they'd be something pretty cute because it's so fuzzy and it must be really comfortable in there. So it's kind of, the prairie version of the Pod People. Except they're not communists, they're cowboys. So, and then this one here is where the deer and the antelope play. And this was actually another one of my earlier transparencies. I found these Roy Rogers and Dale Evans paper dolls. And, it was one of those moments because, cowboy kitsch, I can't help myself. And if, where the deer and the antelope play, they must be playing guitars. So here's a few more. I really enjoy Victorian symbolism and tattoo symbolism, any kind of symbolism, because it's just, it's kind of interesting. It gives it a little bit more depth, and it's kind of like I don't know. But the one on the, I guess, your guys' left is trying to keep my head above water. And that was kind of inspired by, in tattoo symbolism, a sailor would go, when he would go on a voyage, he would get one swallow, and then he'd come back, he'd get another swallow. And it was believed that if he would be cast to sea, that the swallows would lift up his soul so that he could get to wherever he was going, I guess. And then pinups, you can't really help myself. That was kind of based off of an old joke called what does a guitar have in common with a dancing girl? A neck and a G-string. Sorry. So interesting stuff. Tried to incorporate regional history. I found an old cast clay milk wagon, and it was another eureka moment. So the things that I don't know. Just interesting stuff to come across. But I saw that, put together a piece. When I was growing up, my dad lived in this trailer court in Jamestown, and one of his favorite stories is, when you were a little kid, I took you out here and I showed you around and told you, Sabrina, someday this could all be yours. And he's like, and you just had this look on your face, like, well, it's all gonna be mine? But keep in mind, there's, a few cars on blocks and, some old Milwaukee cans. It's pretty impressive. But jackalopes are another theme that I keep coming back to. And it's actually my body on that one. It's called Sometimes It's a Matter of Life and Death. And I started up a burlesque troupe a few years ago with a few friends, and I'd always get mistaken for a drag queen, which I don't know if it was because I was 6 feet tall or because my hair looked really fabulous. You never know. So it's kind of a play on that. Because the jackalope, the jacks are the ones with the antlers. The jennies are the ones that, they could be just mistaken for a jackrabbit. So, but you got the Tin Lizzie Cinderella. It's just kind of a story of, rust to rebuilds. But Also with my cyanotype work, I learned how to do that when I was at MSU, and it was kind of a, it wasn't quite darkroom photography, but you still could use minimal light, and the chemicals weren't nearly as noxious, even though one of the main chemicals involves cyanide, but it's all right. But everything in moderation. But a cyanotype is a photo printing process that produces a blueprint, and it's actually what blueprints are made of. And it's a pretty simple process. You can get a kit, and then you just use sunlight and water to develop it, and you get an interesting monochromatic print. And I often embellish it with watercolor or with color pencils, whatever seems fitting. How I get my negatives, I take photos digitally and then make a negative. It's kind of cheating, but you got to do what you got to do. And often with the cyanotypes, I would go out on these little country cruises. I like to call them prairie adventures or whatever, and just find interesting landmarks around the state. And like the less populated, the better, I think. But I like graveyards, not because I'm a creep, but you can actually learn a lot from the area. Like yet again with the Victorian symbolism, there's different folk art that you'll find out there, such as the German-Russian iron crosses. There's cast iron grave markers, such as these angels here. And then the next trend seemed to be these gravestones that had these portraits on them. And it's just kind of eerie walking around in this, a graveyard in the middle of nowhere. And, you find these white markers and there's these portraits, and like you always see the name, but then it puts a face to the name. And especially when there's imperfections such as chips or whatever, then it just then it's really kind of eerie, but interesting nonetheless. Sometimes we find different abandoned areas. Like this was actually a fieldstone house right off of the Enchanted Highway. And it was just probably, it's probably about the size of my bedroom. My bedroom might actually be larger than this whole structure, or than the interior of the structure. And there was still a cast iron stove in it, which was really interesting. So I always kind of referred to it as my dream house. It was probably just the right size for a girl and a couple cats. Sometimes I find myself at different cultural events throughout the state. I was at Sodbusters a few years ago, or Sodbuster Days, which is out by Fort Ransom. And it's, if you ever get the chance, you should definitely check it out. It's just situated in this beautiful valley. There's horse-drawn farm machinery. There's steam threshers. I find these things interesting. But there was this couple that was dancing to this band, and everybody there. I was definitely one of the younger people there. But there's like people in their 70s, 80s. They're dancing around in circles. They're playing music, and they were having an absolute blast. And this lady was actually in her traditional Norwegian brunad, which I thought was really interesting, kind of close to my heart, seeing old women in traditional attire. But and these two are actually from the Abbey in Richardson, which is another really interesting spot. It was actually inspired by an abbey, or it wasn't inspired, but the man that set it up, Father Worley, I believe. I could be entirely mistaken. But he was actually from Switzerland and came from an abbey there. And I was there maybe 20 years prior to that, so it was just kind of a interesting coincidence. But apparently this abbey houses the Black Madonna, which is a reproduction of the original one in Switzerland. And there's a third one in the world that's, I believe, in Colombia, or Brazil, I'm not entirely sure. But totally by accident, saw two out of the three Black Madonnas. Don't really want to brag, but on our ventures, we often find maybe I am actually kind of a creep now that I think about it, because I found a random raccoon face. But really, when do you find a raccoon face? How does that even happen? So, listen to Joy Division every once in a while, so I called that one "Love Will Tear Your Face Off." But the second image is actually from Sodbuster days, and just interesting horse and mule drawn machinery. Come across abandoned sites. This is actually out close to Dickinson. It's this abandoned coal mine, and I believe it was abandoned in the 30s. I could be completely mistaken, but it was just really cool because there were these Donkey Kong-like coal cars scattered throughout the yard, and where else do you find that? But yeah, just geek out on regional history. Can't help myself. But and then it's interesting too, like when we go on these ventures, I often get a hold of Troy Larson from, he does the Ghost of North Dakota, and he, always has some valuable insight, so that if I find something interesting, it's like, oh, well, have you heard of this one? Usually he does, but I don't think I've one-upped him yet. But that's some big shoes to fill. This summer, I applied for the Folk Art and Traditional Art Apprenticeship Program through the North Dakota Council on the Arts. And Troy Geist is the state folklorist. Did you guys know that we have a state folklorist in North Dakota? It's pretty cool stuff. And he's just this, walking encyclopedia. Like, I called him up, I took a rose mauling class, and I kind of wanted to learn, the art of rose mauling. And he said, well, are you Norwegian? No, no. I was like, well, it's a better partnering if it's something within your ethnic background, because that's the whole thing, is they want you to perpetuate these folk arts so they don't become forgotten. And with some of them, there are actually more people in the state or around the Midwest, like with rose mauling and with Sharon, there's more people in the Midwest that practice these arts than in the actual country where they originated in. There's a woman in Grand Forks who does doll mauling, which is the Swedish equivalent of rose mauling. And there was actually a film crew that came over from Sweden to do this documentary on her and her work, which is just kind of fascinating. It's kind of sad too that, the younger generations don't want to perpetuate, something that's so strong, something so important to their heritage. But Troy, we were talking about, what nationality, what my ethnic background was. It's like, well, there's German and there's Armenian. So then he got really excited because there's not too terribly many Armenians around. But, I didn't pair up with that lady, but I paired up with Meredy Erickson Stoneman, who is based out of Tower City. And I'd go to her farm twice a week, and we'd sit around and cut paper and drink a lot of coffee and watch the birds outside her window. But it was a really interesting experience because, there's some pretty intricate cuts, and we'd always use these little embroidery scissors because that's, what the Germans would traditionally use. But I guess the origins of Scherenschnitte and Wycinanki, which is the Polish equivalent, that's more so collage-based, but with colorful paper and whatnot. But they would actually take these sheep hides and take these sheep shears and cut holes in this hide, and that would be the way that they would decorate their houses, which is pretty hardcore because I imagine you can't really get the intricate cuts unless you're a master hide cutter. But Troy is actually the one that took these photos here, and the sole. Like the main thing with the Scherenschnitte is part of my grant requirement. They wanted me to learn the more traditional designs and whatnot. And these were based off of old illustrations from German children's books that my grandma has around the house. So I got the traditional Christmas theme, and we got a little bit of a little Red Riding Hood, or also known as Rotkäppchen, and then a little gnome. Because they're wonderful. But then, of course, I always have to go back to my cowboy complex. And so then, you use some more Western imagery. I don't know what that, that's too bad. But, so this is actually Vichinanki, the middle one with the cowboy boots. And that's the more, that's the collage oriented. You start with a pattern, and then it's more of a reductive process where you start cutting the more intricate cuts and layer your paper and whatnot. And I'm not the most patient person. You might not believe it, but for some reason, when things are just really picky and intricate, I can focus my attention on that. So I can cut all these dang little leaves here, and it's fine. It's totally fine. I don't want to, I don't Hulk smash it. But the way that you glue it on is you take a toothpick and, kind of dab the back of it and try to make sure everything's smooth and make sure there's no bubbles, because that ruins the whole, 3 to 4 hour paper cut.
Just to give us an idea, how big is this? I mean, is this like here small or large? Just to get an idea, how?
See, this one is maybe on an 11 by 17 sheet, so it's about like this. But that's a good question. The one that I started with is actually, I guess I can go back to it. And it's actually not the best image of it, but it's a mermaid. And that's also part of German folklore. And it's her name is Lorelei. She's the siren of the Rhine. And she was, it's a story of a woman scorned. Her lover wound up doing her wrong, so she cast herself off this cliff into the river, wanting to end it all. But then she wound up she transformed into a mermaid, and she became kind of a siren, a little bit of a femme fatale. She would go on the banks and she would sing and comb her golden hair, and these sailors would come crashing to their death on the rocks. So she's kind of a woman after my own heart. That I might have been kidding. No, I'm kidding. But then through the traditional art apprenticeship program, that wound up leading to my involvement with the Art for Life program, which is another North Dakota Council on the Arts program. And this was kind of a introductory model. We were, there's a lot of trial and error. What we did was we went into this nursing home facility in Jamestown at Ave Maria, and we worked with some of the residents, and we did these paper cuttings, and we did this 7-foot by 7-foot paper tree and adhered it to this sheet. And then we went in for 6 sessions, one every other week. And we would have different themes that we would talk about. So we would go in, and the first one was our roots, where we came from. So then Merity and I would go and we would make our patterns, and it was supposed to be acorns and flowers. So we went in and realized that, the simpler the pattern, the better, because, when there's 2 of you and there's maybe a dozen others, it got a little stressful trying to explain things. And some of the people were a little bit more able than others, and we weren't really sure how able they were going to be. But it was awesome because, it generated the conversation. We talked about our ethnic backgrounds. We talked about, family and whatnot. And some of them who weren't so able, like they could, we just pick or had them pick out the colors, and were very, very encouraging, because it was, it's something that we all looked forward to. And then we would collect some of their life histories and words of wisdom. And then we had snacks, so it was all my favorite things: making art, hanging out with old folks, and eating snacks. So, and this gentleman, we were talking about children, so we made apples and pears, I believe. But it was just kind of interesting because he eventually wound up taking one of the patterns because he wanted to make an apple for each one of his sons, and he actually wrote his son's name, and we put it on the tree, and it was pretty cool. But then and another one was love and marriage, and there was this, and we're talking to these women, they're in their 90s, and I worked at a high-end pastry shop for a while, and we'd make these, or we wouldn't, I would hand them off. I can't take any credit, but they would make these big elaborate wedding cakes, and these women would come in and they'd be talking about, they wanted to live out their dream wedding that they've been dreaming about since they were like little kids, and they would throw down thousands upon thousands of dollars like just on cake alone. And in talking to these women at the nursing home, we'd just be like, well, what kind of cake? She's like, oh, hell, I don't remember. That was a long time ago. That's like, then it just kind of puts everything into perspective, because everybody was, it was utilitarian. They wanted to be together. They felt the need to be together, and people needed each other. And then just a lot of perspective. And I think we all learned a little bit from each other during that session. But at the end of it, we actually wound up having a big art show, and where the residents showed, well, not only did we unveil the tree, but then the residents had their art that they were working on, where, some of it was like shaving cream art and glitter stuff. But then there was also these really intricate handcrafts. There was cross stitching. There was these felt puppets that these other ladies made. There was really beautiful drawings. There was crocheting, But then there were also poems that the residents wrote, and that was really interesting too, because there were some that were reflecting life moments. There were things like that they're reflecting on from their childhood. There were also some that they were kind of talking about getting older and the things that they missed and they wish they could do, and one was actually really fatalistic, and the one aide was telling us that we almost didn't want to put this one up. It's like, well, you got to kind of take the good with the bad. It's not all roses and kuchen, but it was an interesting experience for sure, and hopefully we can do it again. But are there any questions at all? Oh, okay. I guess that's pretty much what I have.
Oh.
So, and I was contemplating whether or not to put some of the images from around North Dakota, but then I didn't know if I was going to go overtime or under time. And all right.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
I know if you meant questions until now, it's something like that. But
okay.
Well, let's thank Sabrina for coming here and presenting.
Thank you.
Yeah. So was this just recent?
It was, yep. Our last session the opening was on May 17th, I believe. Or maybe it was May 12th. It was somewhere within that week. Yeah. Oh, and one of the highlights too is when we would be starting to adhere some of the images to the tree. We were sitting in the activities room during bingo, and there were some pretty heated bingo games. It was pretty comical, And then we had everything at this one table, and there's a group of ladies that they were giving us dirty looks the whole time, because apparently that was their table. And there's those art center people are taking our table. They have all their stuff everywhere. They weren't too impressed with us, but
Can't mess with bingo.
it's true. It's true.
Any other questions?
Hey Sabrina, so is there a process that you prefer, that you go back to time and again?
Well, I do enjoy the mixed media stuff. I do keep going back to that. That's the one that I've been probably doing the longest. But then, it all kind of ties together, oddly enough, because I'm always out trying to find excuses to go out in the middle of nowhere and take pictures of abandoned stuff. But so then I'm always taking photos, so I always have stuff to work with, and then it's a matter of all right, so am I going to use this for a mixed media piece, or am I going to make this into a cyanotype? But yeah, I do keep going back to the mixed media. But every once in a while, yeah.
talking about the mixed media, would you be able to go back to a few of those?
Yes.
I was wondering when you talked about that, what part of it was a photo? I mean, you said it was a photo and you painted on the photo, right?
Oh, what I
So what part of it was photo and what part of it did you paint?
what it started out with the photo. That's like the base of it, and then I'd find a bunch of found imagery and I'd make a collage on top of it. So then it would kind of, the background is, and like what I actually do is I paint the stuff that I want to. It's not really my skill in painting. It's just the stuff, because I make it into a transparency, and then I paint the stuff that I want to be like more prominent in the piece, like the cowboys and the milkweed, or the lady and her ring around her halo. But and then I use spray paint for the back of it to give it that kind of a sense of atmosphere.
Okay.
Now, how did you come up with this process, or is this something you've seen other artists do? Or?
Well, I started out by taking black and white photos and then painting the transparency, which was kind of an interesting process because your first marks are the most prominent marks. But then I don't really know what I was doing. It was one of those happy accidents, I guess. But actually, I think it did start with this one. Whenever I'd see those power lines, I'd always think of dress forms. So then I wanted to find a way to like juxtapose like the dirndl on it, because it was, birthright and legacy, combining like the German side with the North Dakota side. So it was just a matter of trying to figure out how to make it happen. I'm not the most confident in my drawing and painting abilities, so I figured the next best thing was to cut and paste.
So you glue it on then?
Yep.
Or then you spray it over with a spray paint?
Well, I glue it all and then take it to the copy shop and then have a transparency made and then paint on the transparency.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
definitely.
Now, okay, I missed that step. Okay.
Yeah, we used to spend a lot of time. We used to get a lot of company from Germany, like my relatives and friends of the family, and we would take these summer trips out to Medora and the Heritage Center, because our relatives would always want to see the cowboy and Indianer, because there aren't many cowboys in Germany, believe it or not.
My parents are like that too.
Yes. So, it was just always kind of interesting, because then my grandpa would actually, be able to talk and tell them about the history and this and this. And then I guess that kind of cultivated my interest, where I was like, wow, that is really interesting. You don't say. But yeah, I guess that's where that all came from.
So did you create the image that's in the bottom right?
No, that one, I found that one online randomly. Though I do kind of want to find a giant jackalope like that.
No, I was just curious because the shadow on it is so interesting.
Oh, yeah.
That's true, there's a shadow on it.
You're right.
You mentioned for some of the photos you cheated by using a digital photo and making a negative out of that. How exactly did you do that?
Photoshop. Yeah. I made a negative and then just kind of boosted the contrast, because through trial and error, the cyanotype shows up a lot better, like when there's more contrast involved. And I had these are mainly from a show that I actually have touring with the North Dakota Art Gallery Association. And that show is called Trail Dust and Sentiment. And that actually opened here at the Plains Art Museum in May of 2014, I believe. It's kind of interesting, so it's coming full circle. But yeah.
I have a question.
Okay.
So your work's really anthropological because it's exploring place, family history, and myth, too. There's a lot of mythic elements that are in it. But, and correct me if I'm wrong, there seems like to be a common thread of North Dakota.
Yep.
So would you define North Dakota, because North Dakota is just an arbitrary state, right? Like we put boundaries on. So do you see that as like your subject or your place? Is that the connection between all these things, or is it something more personal? Or
It is, North Dakota definitely is the main, and just kind of the prairie in general. When I was kind of putting these together, well, it all kind of started with, kind of exploring like ways to like combine, like my upbringing with the staunch North Dakotan and like the staunch German. And I guess that was mostly the common bond. And I was also thinking too, because 2009, when was that? I was like 24, I think. But I was kind of thinking a lot of people my age that I went to school with, they was, oh yeah, I can't wait to get out of North Dakota. This place is terrible. It's the worst. And it's like, well, it's not. It's all. Everything's kind of all in how you make it and how you handle it. And you have to find, you don't want to think that there's a lot of culture here, but there's a lot of really. There is a lot of culture. There's a lot of different ethnic groups. There's like these pockets of culture. Like there's one area, I was out in New Raddick, North Dakota, and there is which is way out west, and there's a church there that still holds services in Czech, which I thought was really interesting, that there's that much of a Czech culture out there that they still attend church services, and there's like all these gravestones that have these women with their scarves around their heads, and and with the Czech word for mother and father, and these inscriptions. But then, like even in Ross, which is also out west, close to Williston, there's a mosque out there, So in going to these different cemeteries, you can get a general idea of these different pockets of culture and folk art and whatnot. And there was actually one of my paper cuttings, and like the main catalyst, or the inspiration for the Vichinanki cowboy boots, I was at the Ukrainian Culture Institute in Dickinson, and there's all these different artifacts, like these traditional costumes and the Ukrainian eggs and whatnot, but they had this really heavy coat that was made out of some kind of hide. And traditionally they're covered with all this really elaborate, colorful embroidery. And what a lot of these Ukrainians would do, or when they came over, they didn't want to be identified as, some Uk, pardon the term. But so they would take all the embroidery off of their jackets because they wanted to identify with cowboy culture. So they were shedding their Ukrainian identity and trying to adapt the cowboy identity, but which is kind of heartbreaking, I think. But
I guess my last question is, what's next?
well, I reapplied for the grant, so hopefully I can get some more paper cutting in. I'm not really sure. I have so many images that I need to make into cyanotypes. So last summer and this summer I was in Montana and Wyoming, and it's just like a whole different landscape and a little bit different than the Red River Valley, Jamestown culture. But yeah, so. And I guess one more thing that I can add is there's going to be a pretty cool art show going on at the old Goodyear building. It's called Wandering Ghost. It's a pop-up gallery, and I'm actually going to have one of my Sharon Schnitta there. But it's going to be a lot of really interesting folks and different colorful art. It is. Yeah. Well, it's tomorrow from noon until midnight, so it's a 12-hour affair.
Brew's on Broadway building now, isn't it?
What's that?
Brew's on Broadway building now, Fargo Brewing
Oh,
Company.
really?
Yeah.
Nice. Cool.